My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31, and I've spent 9 years as a captain in the United States Air Force, trained to read a flight manifest for discrepancies most people would miss on the third pass, trained to stay perfectly level-voiced, while coordinating a response to a situation that would have most people's hands shaking. I know how to hold a room of nervous junior officers steady during a crisis. I know how to compartmentalize fear long enough to do my job first and feel it later. I did not know, it turned out, how to sit through my own daughter's 8th birthday party and keep my face from betraying exactly what I was thinking, as I watched my father hand my nephew the bigger slice of cake. It was a small thing. It's always a small thing at first. That's what nobody tells you about the way favoritism actually works inside a family. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic betrayal you can point to and say, there, that's when it started. It arrives in slices of cake, in who gets asked first, in whose drawing gets taped to the refrigerator, and whose gets quietly recycled by the end of the week. I was standing in my parents' backyard, home on leave for the first time in 4 months, watching my mother light 8 candles on a cake shaped like a unicorn that Sophie had picked out herself 3 weeks earlier, when my father set a second cake down on the table. Chocolate, Logan's favorite, just in case anyone wanted a different flavor. And Logan, my sister Vanessa's 10-year-old son, was the only child who got a slice of it before Sophie had even finished blowing out her candles. Sophie noticed. Of course she noticed. Children always notice, long before the adults around them are willing to admit there's anything to notice at all. I watched my daughter's small shoulders drop, just slightly, the particular deflation of an 8-year-old trying very hard not to make a scene at her own birthday party. And something in my chest went tight and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Colorado wind. If you've ever watched your child absorb a slight before they even had the words to name what had just happened to them, I need you to stay with me because this story does not end where you think it does. I found out I was being deployed 6 weeks before Sophie's birthday, on a Tuesday morning briefing that changed the entire shape of the next 4 months of my life. A temporary assignment, 12 weeks, non-negotiable, the kind of orders that don't leave room for discussion about custody logistics or single-parent contingency plans. I called my ex-husband first, out of obligation more than hope. He'd been stationed overseas himself for the better part of 2 years, and I already knew what he was going to say before he said it. I can't take her right now, Claire. You know that. I did know that. I'd known it before I dialed. I sat in my car in the base parking lot for a long time afterward, running through the short list of people I could actually trust with my daughter for 3 months, and the list, when I was honest out with myself, had exactly one name on it that made any practical sense. My parents, Michael and Diane Bennett, had raised 2 daughters in a house 4 miles from the base. My father, a retired firefighter with 30 years of pulling people out of burning buildings and an entire personality built around the idea that discipline was the same thing as love. My mother, an elementary school teacher who had spent her career gently redirecting other people's children, while somehow never quite managing to redirect her own husband. They had a guest room. They were local. They loved Sophie. I believed that, genuinely, the way you believe things about your own parents, until you're given a specific enough reason not to. What I hadn't accounted for, when I dropped Sophie's suitcase off in that guest room and kissed the top of her head and told her Mommy would call every single night, was Vanessa. My sister had moved back to Colorado 8 months earlier, freshly divorced, staying with our parents, temporarily, with Logan while she rebuilt her real estate business. And in the time I'd been away on shorter assignments, I hadn't fully clocked how completely she'd repositioned herself at the center of our parents' daily life. Vanessa had always been good at that, reading a room, understanding exactly what our father valued, and reflecting it back at him until he couldn't tell the difference between genuine connection and careful management. She'd done it our entire childhood, and some tired, hopeful part of me had assumed adulthood might have changed, that it hadn't. If anything, it had sharpened. If you've ever handed your child over to family, because you believed, genuinely believed, that family was the safest place they could be, comment, I understand below. This story is for you, and it's about to get a lot harder to watch. The first phone call that should have told me something was wrong came in week 3, and I almost missed the signal entirely because it was disguised as something so ordinary. I nearly laughed it off. Sophie had a rough day, my mother said, her voice carrying the particular careful neutrality she used whenever she was reporting something she didn't want to editorialize on directly. She said, Logan's markers went missing, and everyone thought maybe she'd taken them. It turned out they were just in his backpack the whole time. Kids, you know. Did anyone apologize to her? I asked, standing in a supply depot 12 time zones away, phone pressed hard against my ear. A pause, just slightly too long. I'm sure it got sorted out, sweetheart. Don't worry about it. She's fine. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. The way you need to believe a lot of things when you're 12 time zones from your child and utterly unable to do anything about them, even if you didn't. So I let it go. I told myself it was a small thing, the way I'd tell myself the same thing about the cake. 3 months later, the ways I'd tell myself the same thing about a dozen incidents in between that I only fully understood, in hindsight. Once I'd stopped being willing to explain them away one at a time. I called Sophie that night, the way I called her every night, and she sounded fine. A little quiet, maybe, but 8-year-olds get quiet for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with anything sinister. She told me about a book she was reading. She asked when I was coming home. She didn't mention the markers at all, and I told myself that was because it hadn't mattered enough to bring up. Instead of asking myself the harder question of why my daughter, who told me everything, had suddenly started leaving things out. By the time of the birthday party, I'd been back from deployment for exactly 4 days, still recalibrating to a time zone and a life that had kept moving without me, still unpacking the specific disorientation of stepping back into motherhood after 12 weeks of being fundamentally unreachable to the person who needed me most. I'd planned the party around Sophie's actual preferences, the unicorn cake, the friends from her class, the specific purple balloons she'd pointed to in a store 3 weeks before I left, and I'd assumed, walking into my parents' backyard with 24 balloons and a cake box balanced against my hip, that the hardest part of the day would simply be watching my daughter turn 8, without her father in the picture. I did not expect to spend the party doing arithmetic. It started small. Logan got asked, twice, whether he wanted to help blow up balloons before anyone thought to ask Sophie, whose party it was. My father took nearly a dozen photos of Logan opening a gift he'd brought for Sophie, a stuffed animal. Logan clearly wanted for himself, based on the way his hand kept drifting toward it. And exactly 2 photos of Sophie herself, both slightly out of focus, when Sophie asked quietly if she could open her presents from her grandparents before the other kids left. My mother told her to wait, so everyone can watch together, and then let Logan open a just because gift from my father. 20 minutes later, with no such waiting required, none of it on its own was a headline. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. None of it would sound like much of anything if I described a single incident in isolation to a stranger. It was the accumulation that told the real story, the way 60 small signals on an aircraft's instrument panel can each individually mean nothing, and still, together, mean you are heading somewhere you do not want to go. I watched my DOS daughter's face very carefully that afternoon, the way I'd learned to watch faces during 9 years of briefings and debriefings and difficult conversations with subordinates, who were trying very hard not to let me see exactly how much something had cost them. I watched her smile get a little more effortful with each slight. I watched her stop, asking for things around. The 4th or 5th time she didn't get them. And when the party ended and the last of her friends had been picked up, I watched her go quiet in the car in a way that had nothing to do with being tired from a long day. "Did you have a good birthday, baby?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "It was fine," she said, looking out the window instead of at me, and something about the careful, adult flatness of that answer. The same flat, managed non-answer I'd been getting from my mother for 3 months, told me, with a clarity I couldn't afford to ignore any longer, that I had a great deal more to uncover than a slice of chocolate cake. I moved into my own apartment 11 days after Sophie's birthday party, close enough to my parents' house that the custody transition wouldn't disrupt her school schedule, far enough that I finally had a door I could close behind the two of us at the end of a day. It should have felt like relief. Instead, for the first 2 weeks, it felt like standing at the edge of a room where the lights had just gone out, waiting for my eyes to adjust to a shape I already suspected was there, but couldn't yet fully see. Sophie started sleeping with her bedroom door open. She'd never done that before the deployment. She'd always been proud of her ability to sleep with the lights off, told me once. With the particular solemnity of a 6-year-old negotiating for grown-up privileges, that only babies needed the hallway light on. Now she wanted the door open, the hallway light on, and some nights, when I checked on her before I went to bed myself, I'd find her still awake, lying very still, watching the doorway like she was waiting for something. "What are you thinking about, baby?" I asked her one of those nights, sitting on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair back the way I used to, when she was small enough to rock to sleep. "Nothing," she said too quickly, the same flat, managed answer from the car ride home from her party. I didn't push. 9 years of training had taught me that people, including 8-year-olds, maybe especially 8-year-olds, don't open up under direct pressure. They open up sideways, in unguarded moments, when they've forgotten you're listening for something specific. So I waited, and I watched, and I started, without fully admitting to myself what I was doing, yet keeping a small notebook in my nightstand drawer. If you've ever watched your child change in ways you couldn't quite name yet, and started paying closer attention without knowing exactly what you were looking for, comment, "I know that feeling" below. The notebook started as nothing more than dates. October 14th. Sophie asked to sleep with the door open. October 19th. Sophie flinched when I raised my voice slightly at a driver who cut us off, flinched in a way that had nothing to do with me and everything I suspected, to do with someone else's raised voice she'd gotten used to during those 12 weeks. October 23rd. Sophie mentioned offhand that Logan got to stay up later than her at Grandma and Grandpa's house because he's older, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "and because Grandpa likes him more." I wrote that one down word for word, sitting at my kitchen table after she'd gone to bed, my hand not quite steady on the pen. I read it back 3 times. 8-year-olds say a lot of things that sound more dramatic than they mean. I knew that. I also knew, from 9 years of debriefing witnesses who'd seen things they didn't yet have language for, that children rarely invent specific, oddly precise details like that out of nowhere. They report what they've absorbed, and what Sophie had absorbed, apparently, over 12 weeks in my parents' house, was a clear-eyed, matter-of-fact understanding of exactly where she ranked. I called my mother that week, kept my voice light, told her I just wanted to check in about how the last few months had gone. Was everything okay with the kids? Sophie's seemed a little different since she got home. Different how? My mother's voice had the particular brightness she used when she suspected a conversation was heading somewhere she didn't want it to go. I recognized it because I'd inherited a version of it myself, the same trained instinct to smooth a room before it had a chance to get uncomfortable. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "She's just quieter, more careful. She had a wonderful time here, Claire. Ask her yourself." A beat. Kids adjust, that's all. She'll be back to herself in no time. I didn't push further, not because I believed her, but because I'd learned, in a different context entirely, that you don't announce an investigation before you have anything to actually investigate. You gather quietly. You let people continue behaving exactly as they always have, without the awareness that anyone's paying closer attention than usual. Because the moment they know they're being watched, the behavior changes and the evidence disappears with it. I picked Sophie up early from my parents' house on a Saturday in November. 3 weeks into this new, careful watching, ostensibly to take her to a dentist appointment, that was actually scheduled for the following week. I hadn't planned the visit as anything strategic. I told myself, driving over, that I just wanted to see the house in its ordinary, unguarded state, the way it actually operated, when nobody outside the family was paying close attention. I let myself in through the side door, the way I'd done my entire life, and I heard them before I saw them. My father's voice, carrying from the kitchen, the particular hearty warmth he reserved for Logan, that I realized, standing there in the mudroom with my hand still on the doorknob. I had never once heard him use with Sophie. "There's my guy," he was saying. "You want to help me with the grill, real man's work, this." And then, a moment later, Sophie's voice, small and careful, asking if she could help too. "Maybe next time, sweetheart," my mother said, not unkindly, exactly, but with the same absent, redirecting tone she'd probably used on 1,000 students over 30 years. The tone of someone managing a room, rather than actually seeing the child standing in front of her. "Why don't you go find something quiet to do?" I stood in that mudroom for a long moment, my keys still in my hand, doing the specific cold arithmetic I'd spent 3 weeks refusing to let myself finish. Real man's work, something quiet to do. 2 children in the same kitchen. One offered a task built around being wanted, and the other offered dismissal built around being managed, and neither of my parents even aware. I understood now that they were doing it. Which was, somehow, worse than if they had been. This wasn't a single cruel choice. This was a habit, worn smooth over months, invisible to the people inside it. The way water is invisible to a fish. I found Sophie in the living room a few minutes later, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a coloring book, and I sat down next to her instead of announcing myself right away. The way I'd learned to enter a debrief quietly, without disrupting whatever honest thing might still be happening, before people noticed they had an audience. "Watch a drawing," she showed me. A house, a sun, 2 stick figures holding hands. "That's you and me," she said. "I didn't draw here because I don't really draw this house. Why not, baby?" She shrugged, the specific small shrug of a child who has already learned that some questions are safer left unanswered. "I just don't." If your child has ever told you something enormous in 5 words, and then changed the subject before you could ask a follow-up, I want you to know, that's not nothing. That's a door left open half an inch. Comment. I noticed 2 below. I started documenting in earnest after that visit. Not because I had a plan yet. I want to be honest about that. The same honesty I owe anyone hearing this story. But because 9 years of military training had taught me one unshakable rule. If something matters enough that you might need to prove it later, to someone who wasn't there and has every incentive not to believe you, you write it down while it's fresh, with dates, with exact words, before memory has a chance to soften the edges of it. I kept a running log on my phone, backed up to a private cloud folder. I didn't share with anyone yet, not even Sophie's school counselor, whom I hadn't approached yet either. Dates, direct quotes, where I had them. The drawing without the house in it. The real man's work comment. A running list, growing week by week, of the small, precise ways my daughter had learned. Over 12 weeks. Exactly how much space she was allowed to take up in a house that had once, before my sister moved back in with her son, felt like the safest place I could imagine leaving her. I thought, more than once during those weeks, about calling Vanessa directly, sister to sister, and asking her plainly what she'd noticed, whether she'd seen any of what I was starting to piece together. I didn't, in the end, mostly because something about the way she'd repositioned herself so completely at the center of our parents' daily life made me suspicious of what her honest answer would actually be worth. I didn't yet have proof of anything specific involving Vanessa. I only had an old, familiar instinct, the same instinct I'd had my whole childhood, watching my sister manage a room until everyone in it saw exactly what she wanted them to see, telling me that whatever was happening in that house, she was not a bystander to it. I met Emily Carter, Sophie's school counselor, for the first time in early December, ostensibly for a routine check-in that the school scheduled for any student returning from a significant family disruption. I hadn't expected the meeting to tell me anything I didn't already suspect. I was wrong. "Sophie's been a little withdrawn in class," Emily told me, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who did this for a living, who understood exactly how much weight a single sentence could carry to a worried parent. Nothing alarming, necessarily. But she mentioned something last week, during a group exercise about family, that I wanted to flag for you directly, rather than just noting it in a file. I sat very still. What did she say? The exercise asked the kids to draw their family and talk about who makes them feel safe. Emily glanced down at a folder on her desk, then back up at me. "Sophie drew you. Just you." When I asked gently about her grandparents, she said, and I'm quoting her directly, because I wrote it down right after the session, she said, "Grandpa likes Logan's version of me, better. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was doing the arithmetic again, the same cold, precise calculation I'd been doing since the birthday party. Except now it had a name and a direct quote attached to it. Something concrete enough to write down alongside everything else in that growing folder on my phone. "I'd like to keep an eye on this together, if that's all right with you," Emily said. "I'll document what I observe here at school. It sounds like you're already doing the same thing at home." "I am," I told her, and for the first time since the birthday party. Saying it out loud to someone who wasn't inside my own head felt less like paranoia and more like exactly what it was. A mother, quietly, methodically, building the case she prayed she'd never actually need to use. There was a woman 2 houses down from my parents named Rachel Foster, a registered nurse who'd lived on that street longer than I'd been alive, the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's schedule without ever seeming nosy about it, who brought soup when someone was sick and noticed in the specific, attentive way. Nurses notice things when something in a household's rhythm had shifted. I'd known her my whole life. I hadn't thought of her as relevant to anything until the second week of December, when I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a coat Sophie had left behind, and Rachel was out front trimming the hedge that bordered both their properties. "Claire." She straightened up, pulling off her gardening gloves. "Good to see you back. How's the little one settling in?" "Getting there," I said, which was as much as I was willing to offer a neighbor. However kind, Rachel studied me for a moment longer than the small talk required, the particular assessing look of someone who'd spent 30 years reading patients' faces for the things they weren't saying out loud. "I don't want to speak out of turn," she said carefully, "but I noticed some things this fall, while you were away. Sophie used to come sit on my porch some afternoons, when your parents had errands to run and the other one, Logan, had friends over. She was quiet, polite, always said she was fine." A pause. "I've raised 3 kids and worked in pediatrics for a decade, Claire. I know what fine sounds like when it isn't." My stomach went tight and cold, in the same place it had gone tight at the birthday party. "What did you notice specifically?" "Small things." She'd flinch a little when your father raised his voice at the TV, of all things. Nothing to do with her. Just a ball game he was yelling at. But she'd go very still, like she was bracing for something. Rachel's mouth tightened, and there was an afternoon in late October. "I want to say, I heard raised voices from your parents' kitchen, your mother's voice mostly. Something about missing markers, I believe. And Sophie came out onto the porch afterward, and just sat with me for almost an hour, without saying a word. Didn't cry, didn't complain. Just sat there very quietly until your mother called her in for dinner. I wrote every word of that down in my car, 5 minutes later, hands not quite steady, on the notebook Rachel's name and the date at the top of the page. The same careful documentation I'd have demanded from any witness reporting an incident under my own command. I didn't yet know what I was going to do with any of this. I only knew, with the same cold clarity that had been building for weeks, that the picture was no longer made up of isolated dots I could talk myself out of connecting. Rachel Foster had just handed me an outside witness, unprompted, unaware she was giving me anything more than neighborly concern. And outside witnesses, I understood from 9 years of building cases against far less sympathetic subjects than my own parents, were worth more than 100 pages of my own private notes. If you've ever had someone outside your family confirm, almost by accident, something you'd been afraid you were imagining. Comment, it wasn't just me below. We're getting closer to the part where everything breaks open. Christmas that year fell on a Sunday, and my parents hosted, the way they always had. The whole extended family crowded into a living room that had felt enormous when I was a child, and now felt watching my father settle Logan onto his knee for a photo, while Sophie stood half a step back, smaller than I remembered it. I brought my notebook with me in my bag, not because I expected to need it that day specifically, but because by December, I'd stopped leaving the house without it, the same reflexive habit as carrying my service ID. Vanessa cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling a water glass, her voice pitched low and warm in the particular register she used when she wanted something to sound like concern, rather than what it actually was. "I know things have been an adjustment, with you being gone so long," she said, stirring cream into her coffee without quite meeting my eyes. Logan's really taken to having a little cousin around. I think it's been good for him, honestly, having someone smaller to look out for. Sophie mentioned Logan gets to stay up later, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. And that Dad likes him more. Vanessa's laugh came a half second too quickly, a half second too bright. Kids say all kinds of things, Claire. You know how sensitive Sophie can be. I wouldn't read too much into it. She set her spoon down with a small, deliberate click against the counter. Honestly, I think it's important she learns. The world doesn't revolve around her feelings every single time something doesn't go exactly her way. Logan's had to learn that too. I didn't answer right away. I stood there, water glass sweating faintly against my palm, watching my sister's face for the thing underneath the warmth. The thing I'd watched her manage rooms with my entire life, and I understood, with a clarity that settled into my chest, like a stone, dropping to the bottom of still water, that I was no longer looking at a woman who hadn't noticed anything. I was looking at a woman who had noticed everything, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that it suited her purposes not to. I wrote that conversation down too, word for word, sitting in my car in my parents' driveway before I'd even pulled out onto the street. Sophie buckled quietly into her booster seat in the back, watching the house recede in the side mirror, without a single word of protest at leaving early. I had a training rotation scheduled for the last week of January. 4 days close enough to home that I told myself it barely counted as being away at all. 4 days. I'd left Sophie with my parents dozens of times before the deployment ever happened. Back when 4 days felt like nothing. Back before I understood what 12 weeks in that house had actually cost her. I almost didn't go. I sat in my kitchen the night before, keys already on the counter, and asked Sophie directly, the way I'd started asking her things directly instead of hoping she'd volunteer them. Do you feel safe at Grandma and Grandpa's house? She was quiet for a long moment, tracing a finger along the edge of the table. It's okay, she said, finally. I just don't like when Logan tells lies and everyone believes him. My hand went still on my coffee mug. What kind of lies, baby? Just stuff. It's fine, Mommy. I don't want you to miss your training. She said it with the particular unnerving maturity of a child who has learned to manage her mother's worry rather than simply express her own, and that, more than anything else she could have said, was what nearly made me cancel the rotation on the spot. I didn't, in the end. I told myself 4 days was manageable, that I'd talk to Emily Carter again the moment I got back, that the notebook and Rachel's account and everything I'd gathered so far was enough to start acting on soon. Just not yet. Not until I had a clearer plan than simply pulling Sophie out of her grandparents' orbit and hoping the fallout didn't make things worse for her at school and in the family both. I was wrong to wait. I understand that now, with a clarity that still, months later, makes my jaw tighten every time I let myself think about it directly. If you've ever made a call you believed was reasonable at the time, and later had to live with exactly how wrong that calculation turned out to be, comment, I've been there below. This is the hardest chapter to tell. The theft happened on the second night of my rotation. Though I didn't learn the details until much later, pieced together from Emily's notes, from Sophie herself once she was ready to talk, and eventually from Logan's own halting admission. My mother's grandmother's brooch, a small, old-fashioned piece of costume jewelry, that had sat in a dish on her dresser for as long as I could remember, worth almost nothing in dollars, and worth, to my mother, considerably more than that, went missing from her bedroom sometime in the early evening. My mother noticed within the hour. Logan, according to what came out weeks later, had taken it himself, wanting it for a school project about family heirlooms, and had panicked when he couldn't find a way to put it back before anyone noticed it gone. He told Vanessa he thought Sophie might have taken it. I don't know, even now, exactly what calculation ran through my sister's mind in the moment she heard that. Whether she believed it outright, or simply understood that, believing it, and encouraging others to believe it, solved a more immediate problem for her son than the truth would have. What I know is that within 20 minutes, my mother was searching Sophie's things in the guest room, while my father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, using the specific stern, disappointed voice I remembered from my own childhood, the one that had never once, in my memory, been aimed at anyone but me or my sister when we were young, and never, as far as I could tell, aimed at Logan at all. Sophie told me later. Much later. Once she trusted that telling me wouldn't cost her anything. That she had cried and said she didn't take it, that nobody believed her, that my father told her lying runs in the family sometimes, in a tone she didn't fully understand, but that made her stomach hurt anyway. Emily's notes, when I finally saw them, corroborated the timeline from the school's side. Sophie came in the next day, with red, swollen eyes, told a classroom aide she'd had a bad night, and wouldn't elaborate further until Emily pulled her aside privately that afternoon. What happened next is the part I have to force myself to say plainly, without softening it. Because I think softening it would be its own kind of dishonesty. My mother, still convinced Sophie had taken the brooch and hidden it somewhere in the yard, sent her outside that evening to think about what she'd done and consider telling the truth. This, while a storm system that had been building over the mountains all afternoon, rolled in faster than the forecast had predicted. Sophie was outside for 11 minutes before Rachel Foster, watching from her own porch. As the sky went the particular greenish color that precedes serious weather in that part of Colorado, saw an 8-year-old girl standing alone in my parents' backyard in a light jacket, as the first hard gusts came through, and called out to her. Then called 911 when Sophie, soaked and shaking, told her through the fence that she wasn't allowed back inside. Yet, I need you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further. An 8-year-old girl left outside during a violent storm because the adults responsible for her decided a missing costume brooch mattered more than her safety. If this has made your hands go still the way it made mine, comment, "I'm still here" below, and stay with me. The worst of it is almost over. I was 4 hours away when I got the call. Sitting in a debrief, I walked out of mid-sentence the moment I saw Emily Carter's name on my phone. A call outside of school hours that I understood, before I even answered it, could not possibly be good news. "Sophie's safe," were the first words out of her mouth, which told me everything about how bad the rest of the call was going to be, before she said another syllable. "She's with the police right now, and with paramedics as a precaution. She's cold. A little shaken, but physically she's going to be all right. I need you to hear the rest of this calmly, Claire, because you're going to need to be calm for her." I don't remember most of the drive home. I remember gripping the steering wheel, hard enough that my knuckles went white, the particular tunnel vision focus I'd trained myself else into during actual emergencies taking over, because it was the only thing keeping me from losing the ability to drive at all. I remember Officer Jason Reed's voice on the phone, 20 minutes into that drive, calm and procedural in a way I recognized and clung to, walking me through exactly what had happened, exactly where Sophie was, exactly what came next. "She's in good hands, Captain Bennett," he told me. He'd looked up my rank before calling. I realized later, a small, deliberate kindness meant to give me something steady to hold on to. Mrs. Foster acted fast. "Sophie's going to be okay. I do need to ask you some questions when you arrive, about the circumstances that led to her being outside, but that can wait until you're here safely. Drive careful." I found Sophie at the hospital, wrapped in a blanket, her hair still damp, her small hand curling into mine. The moment I reached the bed the way it hadn't done so easily since before the deployment, like some frozen, careful part of her had finally been given permission to stop managing the room and just be afraid instead. "I didn't take it, Mommy," she said, before I'd even fully sat down. "I didn't take Great-Grandma's brooch. Nobody believed me." "I believe you," I told her, and I meant it with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence yet, and everything to do with the plain fact of who my daughter was. "I believe you completely, and I am never, ever going to leave you somewhere that doesn't believe you again." My parents arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after I did, and I heard my mother's voice in the hallway before I saw her face, that same bright, managed tone, except now it had a ragged edge to it that hadn't been there before, the sound of someone realizing, in real time, that a situation had slipped entirely outside her ability to smooth it over. "Is she all right? Claire? Is she? She's alive?" I said, and I watched my own flatness land on my mother's face like a slap, watched her flinch at the 2 words I'd chosen, instead of the reassurance she'd clearly been hoping for. No thanks to the decision that put her outside in a storm. My father hung back near the doorway, arms crossed in the same posture he'd used, according to Sophie's account. While my mother searched her things for a brooch she'd never touched, he didn't apologize. I want to be precise about that, because I've turned that moment over more times than I can count in the months since. He didn't say he was sorry. Didn't ask how she was doing beyond the same clipped question my mother had already asked. He said, instead, in the low, gravel voice I remembered from every disciplinary conversation of my own childhood. She should have just told the truth. None of this would have happened if she'd just told the truth. Something in my chest went perfectly, dangerously still. She did tell the truth, Dad. She told you the truth from the first minute you asked her, and none of you believed her, because it was never actually about the brooch. It was about which of these two kids gets the benefit of the doubt in this family, and Sophie has never once gotten it. Not tonight. Not in October. Not at her own birthday party. That's not fair, my mother said, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard from her since I was a teenager. And for one brief, disorienting moment I almost softened, the same old reflex kicking in, the one that had spent 30 years managing her feelings before my own. I didn't let it land this time. I'd spent 3 months learning exactly what that softening cost, and I understood, standing in that hallway. With my daughter's damp hair still cold against my shoulder, from where I'd carried her earlier, that I had exactly one more decision left to make, about whose comfort came first in this family, and it was not going to be theirs. I have 3 months of documentation, I told them. Quietly enough that a passing nurse didn't glance up, but clearly enough that neither of them could later claim they hadn't understood me. Dates. Direct quotes. A witness. The school counselor's own notes. I wasn't planning on needing any of it tonight. I am very glad, now, that I have it anyway. My mother's face did something complicated at that. Shock, first, and underneath the shock, something that looked almost like relief. The specific relief of someone who has just realized a burden they didn't know how to put down has finally, mercifully, been taken out of their hands. My father's face did nothing at all. He simply turned and walked back toward the waiting room chairs. The same avoidant instinct, I suspected, had shaped every difficult conversation in that house for 30 years. And I understood, watching him go, that whatever came next, I would not be getting an apology out of him that night, and possibly not for a long time after. If you've ever had a parent respond to their grandchild's suffering with, "She should have just told the truth," instead of asking why nobody believed her in the first place, I want you to know that response tells you everything you need to know about where accountability actually sits in that house. Comment, I hear you below. Officer Reed took my statement in a small hospital family room an hour later, and it was there, methodically, question by question, that I finally handed over everything I'd been quietly gathering since October. The notebook with its dictates and direct quotes. Rachel Foster's account from the porch conversation in December. Emily Carter's own documentation from the school counselor's office. The drawing without a house in it. I watched his expression shift as he read through it, the particular controlled stillness of someone recognizing that what looked, at first glance, like a single terrible incident was actually the visible tip of something that had been building for months. "This is going to help enormously," he said when he finished. "I want to be straightforward with you, Captain Bennett. What happened tonight on its own is already serious enough to warrant a full investigation. What you've handed me here tells me it isn't isolated, and that matters, both for building the case and for understanding exactly what Sophie's been through." I nodded, my hand still wrapped around my daughter's smaller one, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I can only describe, even now, as the exact moment I stopped, hoping this could be handled quietly, gently, in a way that spared my parents' feelings, or preserved some fragile, salvageable version of the family I'd grown up believing I had. I had spent 3 months collecting evidence I prayed I'd never actually need to use. I no longer had the luxury of that particular hope. I thought, sitting in that small room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead, about every small dismissal I'd watched all fall, every slice of cake, every something quiet to do, every careful non-answer from my mother when I'd asked if everything was okay. None of those things, taken alone, would have been enough to justify what I was about to do next. Together, stacked against a storm and a brooch and an 8-year-old girl, standing alone in a yard while the sky turned green above her, they left me with exactly one calculation left to make, and it was not a complicated one. I was done protecting my parents' comfort at the cost of my daughter's safety. I had been doing exactly that in smaller ways, for months, waiting, documenting quietly, telling myself I needed a clearer plan before I acted. The storm had taken that luxury away from me permanently, and looking back, I understand now that some part of me is grateful for that, however much it cost to get there. I no longer had to decide whether the evidence was enough. The evidence had already decided for me. If you've ever reached the moment where wait and see simply stopped being an option, where the only choice left was to act fully, without half measures, I want you to know that moment doesn't feel like courage while you're in it. It just feels like finally putting down something you should never have had to carry alone. We're almost to the reveal. Stay with me. Vanessa called me twice that night, and I let both calls go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I genuinely did not trust myself yet to speak to my sister without saying something I couldn't take back before I had all the facts in front of me. Her first message was clipped, defensive, already rehearsing a version of events that positioned her as blindsided rather than complicit. Claire, I just heard this is insane. Obviously, Logan would never actually think Sophie stole anything. I think there's been some kind of miscommunication. Call me back. The second message, left an hour later, had shifted register entirely, the same recalibration I'd watched my mother perform over the phone. Months earlier, when the acquisition, no. That was a different story I'd read once, a different family entirely. But the instinct was the same. The specific, practiced pivot of someone realizing the first version of events they'd offered wasn't going to hold. Look, I talked to Logan. He's really upset. I think he just got confused about where he last saw the brooch, and things kind of spiraled from there. Kids exaggerate things, Claire. You know how it is. I really don't think this needs to become a whole thing with the police. I saved both voicemails to the same folder where I'd been keeping everything else since October. Transcribed word for word, dated, timestamped. A whole thing with the police. My sister's 10-year-old son had let an 8-year-old girl take the blame for something he'd done. Had watched her get sent outside into a storm, rather than correct the record. And the language my sister reached for, unprompted, was concern about whether this needed to become a whole thing. Not concern for Sophie, not even, really. Concern for Logan's own conscience, but concern for how contained the fallout could be kept. I didn't call her back that night. I didn't call her back the next day either. Though she tried 4 more times, each message a little more anxious than the last. The anxiety of someone watching a carefully managed situation slip further outside her control with every hour that passed. On the 3rd day, Officer Reed called to tell me that Logan had, in a conversation with his mother present, finally admitted taking the brooch himself, panicking, and letting the blame land on Sophie, because it was, in his own halting 10-year-old words, easier than telling everyone I did it. I thought about that phrase for a long time after I hung up, easier. Not malicious, in the way I think people picture when they imagine a child capable of something like this. Just easier. The same small, human cowardice that any of us might reach for under enough pressure. Except that in this house, that cowardice had been allowed to run all the way to its worst possible conclusion, because nobody with the authority to stop it had cared enough to ask a single hard question before deciding Sophie was the one who must be lying. I thought about arithmetic again, the word I kept coming back to without quite meaning to. The quiet, accumulating math of who gets believed and who doesn't, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who gets sent outside to think about what she's done. Logan had done something wrong, and the system around him had absorbed the cost of that wrong entirely onto the one child in the house who had never once, in 3 months, been given the presumption of innocence that everyone else took for granted, as simply how families were supposed to work. I understood, finally, sitting in my apartment with Sophie asleep down the hall, her door open, the hallway light on, exactly what I was infrastructure for in that family, and exactly what I was going to do about it. This was no longer about proving I'd been right to feel uneasy since a birthday party in October. It was about making certain, in whatever way the law and the truth would actually allow, that nothing like this ever happened to my daughter again. The investigation took 6 weeks, longer than I expected. Though Officer Reed had warned me from that first night in the hospital family room that cases involving minors move carefully, deliberately, with every statement cross-checked, before anyone builds a conclusion that could follow a family for the rest of their lives. I spent those 6 weeks doing the only thing that had ever actually made sense to me under pressure. My job, methodically, one document at a time, treating my own family's case with the same disciplined precision I'd bring to any investigation I'd ever been part of in uniform. Emily Carter submitted her full counseling file, 11 pages, documenting Sophie's behavioral changes from September through the storm, cross-referenced with the specific dates in my own notebook. Rachel Foster gave a formal statement, then a second one, when investigators asked her to walk through the porch conversation from December in more detail, and a third, finally, describing exactly what she'd seen from her window. The night of the storm, the greenish sky, the first hard gusts, an 8-year-old standing alone at the edge of the yard, with her arms wrapped around herself, not moving toward the house because she'd been told not to come back in until she told the truth she'd already been telling from the very beginning. Logan's confession, once it finally came in, full, filled in the last piece investigators needed. He hadn't planned any of it, not really. He'd taken the brooch on an impulse for a school project, panicked when he realized how much trouble he'd be in, and let a single unplanned lie metastasize across an entire evening, because nobody in that house had ever once asked him to slow down and consider the cost of it landing on someone else. I want to be fair to him even now, even knowing what it cost my daughter. He was 10. He made a coward's choice in a single unguarded moment, the kind almost any child might make under enough pressure. What made it unforgivable wasn't the lie itself. It was everything that came after it. The adults who chose to believe the version of events that required the least effort from them, instead of asking a single hard question of the child who had never given them a reason to doubt her before that night. If you've ever watched a small human mistake get allowed to spiral into something enormous, simply because nobody in a position of authority wanted to do the harder work of slowing down and asking better questions, comment, "I've seen this happen below. We're at the reveal now." Everything comes out into the light from here. I requested a family meeting 3 weeks into the investigation, once Emily and Officer Reed had both confirmed. There was enough established fact on record that I could finally say everything I needed to say, without worrying that doing so might compromise the case itself. I held it in a neutral space, a small conference room. Emily helped me arrange through the school district's family services office, rather than in anyone's home, because I understood, by then, exactly how much of what had gone wrong in that family had been allowed to happen, because it always happens inside familiar walls, where everyone already knew which chair to sit in and which subjects to avoid. My parents came. Vanessa came, alone, without Logan, which I understood, without needing it explained, was its own kind of admission. Emily sat beside me. I'd brought a folder, the physical version of everything that had lived on my phone since October, printed and organized the way. I'd once organized reports for review boards that didn't have the luxury of taking anyone's word for anything without documentation behind it. "I'm not here to relitigate what happened," I said, once everyone had settled into a silence, heavy enough that I could hear the building's heating system cycling on somewhere down the hall. "The investigation has already established most of it. I'm here because I think all 3 of you need to hear, in one room, together, exactly what this cost my daughter, and exactly what I need from each of you going forward, because there isn't going to be a version of this family that continues on, as though none of it happened." My mother's hands were folded tightly on the table, her knuckles pale. "Claire, we love Sophie. Whatever mistakes were made." "They weren't mistakes," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same steady register I'd used my entire career to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. "A mistake is forgetting a school pickup time. What happened to my daughter was months of small, repeated choices, each one telling her clearly which grandchild mattered more, and then one very large choice, on the worst night of it, to leave her outside in a storm, rather than simply believe her, the first time she said she hadn't done anything wrong. I opened the folder. I have 11 pages from her school counselor, documenting the pattern starting in September. I have a dated witnessed account from your own neighbor, describing exactly what she observed for months without ever being asked. I have my own notes from the very first week. Sophie came home changed through the birthday party, through Christmas, and I have Logan's own statement on record with the police, confirming that he lied and that no one in that house asked him a single serious question before deciding my daughter must have. I laid it all out, page by page, letting the silence stretch as long as it needed to, after each one. My father didn't speak. He sat with his arms crossed the same way he had in the hospital hallway, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere on the middle distance of the table. And I understood, watching him, that whatever internal reckoning was happening behind that stillness, it was not going to arrive in that room, not that day, possibly not for a long time. Yet, my mother cried quietly, her composure finally cracking in a way I hadn't seen since I was a teenager. I didn't want to believe it could be that bad, she said. And for the first time in months, it sounded less like a rehearsed line and more like something true, finally forcing its way out. I thought I was just keeping the peace. I thought if I didn't make it a bigger deal, it would just resolve itself. It didn't resolve itself, I said. It resolved itself right into an ambulance. Vanessa was the last to speak, and when she finally did, her voice had none of the smooth, managed warmth I remembered from the kitchen at Christmas. I know what it looks like, she said. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't notice things were unfair. I did. I told myself Logan needed the extra attention because of the divorce, because he'd had a hard year, and somewhere in there I stopped thinking about what that meant for Sophie. I'm not proud of that. I don't have an excuse for the brooch, or for not asking him harder questions before it all fell apart the way it did. She stopped, throat working for a moment before she continued. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't undo any of it. It didn't undo any of it. I told her that plainly, without cruelty, but without softening it either, because I'd spent 6 weeks learning exactly how much softness cost when it was extended before anyone had actually earned it. An apology is a start, I said. It's not the same thing as Sophie being safe. Those are two different projects, and I need you to understand that I'm going to need to see the second one, consistently, over time, before the first one means very much to me. I told them, plainly, what I needed going forward. No unsupervised time between Sophie and Logan, until a family therapist Emily had recommended, felt it was appropriate to reintroduce it. A formal acknowledgement from my parents to Sophie herself. Not a group statement designed to smooth things over quickly, but an actual, specific apology naming the specific things they'd gotten wrong. I told them I wasn't asking anyone to perform reconciliation for an audience. I was asking for the slow, unglamorous work of actually earning back trust that had been spent, recklessly, over months, on the comfort of not having to examine an old, worn habit of favoritism that none of them, until that storm, had ever been forced to look at directly. I don't know yet what this family looks like on the other side of this, I told them, closing the folder in front of me. I know what it can't look like anymore. It can't look like a house where one child gets asked to help with the grill, and the other gets told to find something quiet to do, and everyone involved tells themselves that's just how kids are. It can't look like doubting a child who has never once given anyone a reason to doubt her, simply because believing someone else was more convenient. Whatever comes next, that part is not negotiable. If you've ever had to sit across from the people who raised you and tell them, plainly, exactly what you needed changed before you could trust them with your child again, I want you to know that conversation doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like grief and relief arriving in the same breath. Almost there. Stay with me for the ending. Sophie started therapy the following month, a gentle, unhurried process built around play and drawing rather than direct interrogation, the kind of careful work Emily helped me find a specialist for. I watched over the months that followed the particular slow unclenching of a child who had spent a season learning to manage the adults around her instead of simply being a kid in front of them. She started drawing houses again, eventually, our apartment first, then, much later, tentatively, my parents' house, small and careful in the corner of the page, with a single stick figure standing in the yard, and sunshine drawn overhead instead of storm clouds. My father's apology, when it finally came, arrived roughly the way I'd expected it to. Halting, understated, delivered without much eye contact, in the driveway of my apartment building. On a Tuesday afternoon, he'd clearly rehearsed and still couldn't quite get through smoothly. I was wrong, he said, about the whole thing. I should have asked her more questions instead of assuming. I'm sorry, Sophie. He said her name directly, looking at her instead of at me, and Sophie, standing half behind my leg, the way she still sometimes did around him, said only, "Okay, Grandpa," in the careful, watchful voice of a child deciding, in real time, how much of that apology she was willing to believe yet. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. I want to be honest about that, the same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this story. My father and I are still rebuilding something that may never look exactly like what I once believed we had. My mother calls more often now, asks better questions, sits with Sophie at family gatherings, in a way that no longer requires me to watch the room for signs of neglect, though I still watch, out of habit, and probably always will. Vanessa and Logan see Sophie only with a therapist present. For now, a slow, monitored process that may eventually loosen and may, depending on what that process reveals, simply stay exactly where it is. What changed, permanently, wasn't the family, it was the arithmetic. Nobody in that house gets away anymore with deciding quietly which child's word carries weight and which doesn't. Nobody gets to send a scared 8-year-old outside and call it discipline. I made sure of that, the same way I've made sure of everything else that's ever mattered in my life, carefully, methodically, with the evidence laid out plainly enough that no one in that room could ever again pretend they hadn't understood exactly what they'd done. Sophie asked me, one night in early spring, tucked into bed with her door open and the hallway light on, whether Grandpa and Grandma were going to be okay. I think they're working on it, I told her honestly. The most important thing is that you're okay. That's the only thing I was ever really fighting for. She was quiet for a moment, considering that with the same careful attention she brought to everything now. I think I'm okay, she said finally. I think I'm getting there. That, I've learned, is what real justice actually looks like when you strip away everything dramatic people imagine it should be. Not revenge, not a single triumphant confrontation that fixes everything in one blow. Just the slow, unglamorous work of protecting the person you love, insisting on the truth, even when it costs you. People you'd hoped would simply choose you without ever having to be asked, and letting actions, finally, have the consequences they should have had from the very first slice of cake. The end.